Sandra Whitmore dialed 911 for help, claiming a burglar had broken into her home. But when police arrived, they didn't find a thief. They found the remains of her husband, Adam Whitmore, who had vanished 6 years earlier without a trace. What began as a routine emergency call quickly unraveled into one of the most twisted and chilling murder investigations the town of Willow Creek had ever seen. On a quiet October night in Willow Creek, Ohio, Sandra Whitmore sat alone in her living room, surrounded by silence and shadows. The house was still, the kind of stillness that only those who live alone for too long come to recognize. The wind outside howled softly, brushing fallen leaves across the windows. Then, just past midnight, a noise interrupted the silence. A low creak coming from beneath her feet. Sandra froze. She lived alone. The basement hadn't been touched in years. She had always said it gave her the creeps, especially since her husband, Adam Whitmore, had vanished without a trace 6 years earlier. She rarely entered it, keeping the door locked and the lights off. As the noise persisted, another creak, this time louder. Sandra's heart began to race. Her mind conjured the worst possibilities. A burglar? An animal? Or perhaps something worse? She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice unsteady as she told the dispatcher she believed someone had broken into her home. Her words were jumbled, panicked. She gave her address and waited, every second stretching into an eternity. She stayed upstairs, far from the basement door, clutching a flashlight in one hand and her phone in the other. Police arrived within minutes. 2 officers entered with flashlights and guns drawn, expecting to find a trespasser or maybe signs of a forced entry. But nothing in the house appeared disturbed. No windows were broken, no doors had been tampered with. When they reached the basement, Sandra hesitated to open the door. She handed them the key with trembling hands. The officers descended the stairs cautiously. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, mustier. A heavy odor hung in the air, not strong enough to be immediately alarming, but foul in a way that made the officers exchange glances. The flashlight beam scanned the room. Dust blanketed the shelves. Boxes sat undisturbed in the corners. And then, in the far back corner of the basement, something caught their attention. A small area of the wall didn't match the rest. It was newer, less dust-covered, slightly misaligned with the foundation. One officer knocked on it and heard a hollow thud. It wasn't solid concrete like the rest of the wall. They examined the edges and discovered seams where the panel had been fitted into place. What they found behind it would leave the entire department stunned. The officers pried the panel off and recoiled. A strong wave of rot hit them instantly. There, behind the false wall, wrapped in layers of thick plastic and hidden beneath decaying insulation, was a human body. Mummified by time and the airtight seal of its enclosure, the figure was barely recognizable. Still, a wallet was discovered nearby. Inside was a driver's license belonging to Adam Whitmore, the man who had been missing since 2019. The basement was sealed off immediately, and detectives were called to the scene. Sandra was escorted outside. She stood in the driveway, wrapped in a blanket, visibly shaken. When an officer informed her that a body had been discovered, she appeared stunned, whispering a single word. Who? The question felt ironic. There was only one person who had vanished from her life in such an abrupt, mysterious way. For 6 years, she had maintained the story that Adam had left the house one evening and never returned. His car was found 2 towns away in a supermarket parking lot. There were no charges on his bank accounts, no activity on social media, and no known enemies. The investigation back then had gone cold after a few months. No one suspected foul play, and Sandra never raised any red flags. Now, everything had changed. The 911 call had not revealed an intruder, but something far worse. It had uncovered a secret buried not in memory, but beneath the very floor of the home they once shared. As the coroner arrived and police began to document the scene, neighbors emerged from their homes in stunned silence, watching as detectives pulled a body bag from the basement steps. The town of Willow Creek, sleepy and uneventful, had just become the center of a chilling discovery. And for Sandra Whitmore, the truth she may have buried was finally clawing its way back into the light. 6 years before the gruesome discovery, Sandra Whitmore appeared to be living an ordinary, content life with her husband, Adam. They had been married for nearly 10 years, and although not flashy or overly affectionate in public, their relationship seemed stable from the outside. Adam worked as a science teacher at Willow Creek High School, where he was well-liked by students and respected by his colleagues. He was known for his quiet demeanor, a man of routine and dependability. Sandra, on the other hand, stayed home and occasionally worked as a freelance editor, mostly for local writers and bloggers. Their life was quiet, uneventful, and seemingly harmonious. One morning in March of 2019, that image shattered. Sandra walked into the Willow Creek police station, pale and visibly distressed, and reported her husband missing. She told the officers that Adam had left the previous evening to pick up a few groceries and never returned. His phone went straight to voicemail, and he hadn't shown up for work the next day. At first, police considered the possibility of an accident or medical emergency. A search began immediately, and his car was soon found abandoned in a Kroger parking lot 20 miles away from their home. There was nothing inside that pointed to a struggle. The keys were still in the ignition, the doors locked, and the car was clean. The case grew more confusing by the day. There were no withdrawals from his bank accounts. His credit cards had not been used. His phone remained off. Security cameras at the supermarket showed his car entering the lot, but no footage of Adam himself ever walking into the store. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Sandra cooperated with the investigation, attending interviews and offering what little she knew. She claimed their marriage had been going well, and that Adam had shown no signs of depression, anxiety, or desire to run away. Despite her cooperation, investigators couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. Something about the case didn't sit right. But with no evidence of foul play and no digital trail to follow, they were left with nothing. Tips stopped coming in, leads dried up. After a year, the case was placed in cold case files, with the hope that someday someone might stumble upon new information. In the meantime, life in Willow Creek slowly returned to normal. People mourned the mystery of Adam's disappearance in hushed tones at the local diner and the church gatherings. Sandra, though visibly affected, continued with her life. Over time, she began remodeling parts of the house. She repainted the kitchen, replaced furniture in the living room, and told friends she was trying to move on. No one questioned her motives. In fact, many admired her strength. She never dated anyone publicly, nor did she ever consider selling the house. She remained rooted in Willow Creek, attending local book clubs and volunteering at the public library on weekends. Occasionally, people would ask about Adam, and she would quietly say, "I still don't have answers," before changing the subject. Her grief felt authentic, and with no contrary evidence, people believed her. The house itself, however, remained largely untouched beneath the surface. The basement had always been Adam's domain. He used it as a workspace for school projects and stored old textbooks, tools, and science models down there. After his disappearance, Sandra claimed she couldn't bring herself to go down into the space. The memories were too painful, she said, and she left it locked. No one questioned that either. She was a grieving woman, doing what she needed to survive. If she chose to seal off a part of the house, that was her right. The truth was, the house was never just a home. It had become a tomb. And no one realized it. For 6 years, Adam Whitmore's body lay hidden beneath the very floor where Sandra drank her morning coffee, where she watched TV, read books, and entertained guests. The man everyone thought had disappeared without warning had never left. He was always there. Out of sight, but never out of reach, concealed behind a wall no one thought to examine. And while the town moved on, whispering less and less about the man who vanished, Sandra walked among them with the burden of a lie so deeply buried It took the sound of creaking floorboards to bring it back to the surface. The morning after Adam Whitmore's remains were discovered, the quiet town of Willow Creek woke to a wave of disbelief, suspicion, and curiosity. News crews began setting up outside the Whitmore residence before sunrise, their bright lights glaring against the early mist. Neighbors, previously quiet and respectful, stood behind police tape, whispering theories and pointing toward the old colonial-style house where the shocking secret had been buried for years. Inside, the atmosphere was colder than ever. Detectives scoured the home, collecting evidence, taking photographs, and documenting every inch of the basement and the concealed cavity where Adam's body had been found. The coroner transported the remains to the county lab for an autopsy, which promised to be the most revealing step yet in this unraveling mystery. While the investigation resumed with renewed urgency, Sandra Whitmore was taken to the Willow Creek Police Department for questioning. She did not ask for a lawyer. She sat calmly, wrapped in a cardigan, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. Her demeanor was not what officers expected. There were no tears, no visible signs of panic or guilt. She seemed more dazed than anything, an actress caught in the middle of a performance she had rehearsed too many times, now unsure if the curtain had truly fallen. Detectives began asking questions, carefully at first, starting with how long she had known there was someone in her basement the night before. Sandra claimed she had heard the noises only for the first time that evening. She stuck to her story. She had called 911, fearing a break-in, and was just as shocked as anyone to learn that her long-missing husband had been inside her home the whole time. But the facts said otherwise. As crime scene analysts dug deeper, inconsistencies began to appear. The panel used to conceal Adam's body had been carefully measured and installed using materials not original to the home. A receipt for construction supplies, dated just 3 days after Adam was reported missing, was found in a kitchen drawer bearing Sandra's name and signature. Tools in the basement showed recent use, despite her claim that she had not stepped foot down there in years. Forensics identified traces of cleaning agents used to mask odors and chemical compounds absorbed into the concrete floor, evidence of decomposition long before any noise had occurred. What began as a shocking discovery was rapidly morphing into a homicide investigation. The autopsy results only deepened the suspicion. Adam Whitmore had not died of natural causes or an accident. Blunt force trauma to the back of his skull was determined to be the cause of death. There were no signs of defensive wounds, indicating he had likely been struck from behind. Additionally, traces of sleeping medication were found in his system, enough to severely impair his ability to remain conscious, let alone fight back. Sandra's story had officially unraveled. Detectives revisited the details of Adam's disappearance in 2019 with fresh eyes. They uncovered that, in the months leading up to his vanishing, Adam had met with a divorce attorney. Though no paperwork had been filed, records showed several email exchanges in which he expressed concern about Sandra's behavior. In one, he claimed he felt increasingly unsafe in his own home, though he didn't elaborate. Investigators also learned that Sandra had been the sole beneficiary of Adam's life insurance policy, a sizable payout that had helped her remain financially stable after his disappearance. At the time, no one found it unusual. After all, she was the grieving wife left behind. Now, with everything coming to light, that money took on a much darker meaning. Detectives requested access to her digital records and began piecing together a pattern of behavior that pointed toward premeditation. Web searches from her laptop revealed questions like, "How long does a body take to decompose in a sealed room?" and "Can a missing person be declared dead without a body?" They had been made weeks before Adam's disappearance. On their own, the searches were not conclusive, but taken alongside the physical evidence, the autopsy report, and the construction receipts, they painted a clear and disturbing picture. Sandra Whitmore was no longer a grieving wife or a woman seeking closure. She was the prime suspect in a murder investigation that had remained buried under her very floorboards for 6 long years. The arrest of Sandra Whitmore stunned the town in a way that few events ever had. She was taken into custody quietly, without incident, as news crews swarmed the scene to capture every second of her downfall. She wore the same cardigan she had on during the initial interrogation, but the calm expression she once held had dissolved into something blank, unreadable. It was the expression of a person who no longer had the energy to maintain a mask. The community that once pitied her as a grieving widow now watched her as a suspected killer. Murmurs filled grocery store aisles, and coffee shop chatter revolved entirely around the question no one could stop asking: why? The prosecution moved swiftly. They charged her with first-degree murder, citing premeditation based on her online searches, the receipt for building materials, and the evidence of a concealed burial. Prosecutors built a case that portrayed Sandra as a cold, calculating woman who had plotted her husband's death, disposed of his body with chilling precision, and lied convincingly for years. They believed the motive was tied to control, both financial and emotional. With Adam growing increasingly distant, potentially pursuing divorce, Sandra stood to lose everything: the life insurance policy, the house, the stability she had grown dependent on. All of it would have been gone. For someone like Sandra, who had spent her life meticulously constructing the appearance of normalcy, that was too much to risk. As the trial date approached, more pieces of the puzzle began to surface. A former neighbor came forward with an alarming statement. She recalled hearing a loud argument on the night Adam disappeared. At the time, she thought little of it, just another marital dispute that seemed to end quietly. But looking back, she now believed she might have heard the final moments of Adam's life. She described a heavy thud followed by silence. That detail, previously unreported, matched the timeline suggested by the autopsy. The prosecution added her to their witness list. Even more damning were the financial records uncovered from a forgotten bank account Sandra had opened under a different name. Investigators found a series of deposits beginning just days after Adam was declared missing. The account was used to make purchases that never showed up in her public expenses: new electronics, expensive wine, clothing. Though subtle, the spending painted a picture of someone who had not only planned ahead, but had also celebrated a victory behind closed doors. But the most shocking revelation came when detectives uncovered a series of emails exchanged between Sandra and a man named Charles Fenton, an old flame from college. They had reconnected shortly before Adam's disappearance and maintained contact for years through encrypted messaging platforms. The tone of their messages changed dramatically after Adam went missing. Sandra spoke freely about being liberated, while Charles hinted at plans to join her in Willow Creek eventually. He never did. His digital footprint vanished about a year after Adam's death, suggesting he may have either ghosted Sandra or sensed something deeply wrong and distanced himself. Despite the mountain of evidence, Sandra's defense team painted a very different narrative. They claimed Adam had been abusive, and that Sandra had acted in fear. They introduced her medical history, which included anxiety, panic attacks, and a brief hospitalization following Adam's disappearance. They argued that her mental health declined so severely that she couldn't tell right from wrong at the time. They implied she had blocked out the trauma of Adam's death and had lived in a state of dissociation for years, genuinely believing he had abandoned her. They challenged the prosecution to prove that Sandra had the physical and psychological ability to kill, hide, and lie so meticulously for so long. The jury now faced an impossible choice. On one hand, there was overwhelming circumstantial and forensic evidence pointing to a deliberate murder. On the other, there was the complex emotional portrait of a woman who may have suffered in silence for years before breaking. The courtroom, packed with reporters, community members, and silent onlookers, held its breath every time someone stepped up to testify. Everyone wanted to know the truth. But as the case neared its end, the bigger question began to emerge. Even if Sandra Whitmore was guilty, was she truly evil, or just desperate enough to bury her past beneath concrete and silence? The courtroom was silent as the final day of Sandra Whitmore's trial arrived. Every seat was filled, and tension gripped the room like a vice. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras banned but their pens moving furiously. Friends, former neighbors, and even strangers drawn by the morbid allure of the case sat stone-faced, watching the woman who had once been a grieving widow now faced the possibility of life behind bars. After weeks of testimonies, evidence, and emotional appeals, it was time for the jury to deliver its verdict. Sandra sat still, eyes downcast, as the foreman stood to speak. The clerk read the verdict aloud, "Guilty of first-degree murder." The words hit like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the room. Sandra showed no reaction, no tears, no outbursts. Just the same detached stillness that had defined her since the beginning. Some said she looked relieved, as if the burden she had carried for 6 long years had finally been lifted. No matter how heavy the consequences, in the weeks that followed her conviction, more questions emerged than answers. Sandra was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called her actions a deliberate, calculated betrayal of the trust shared in a marriage. Still, despite the mountain of evidence and the clarity of the verdict, whispers continued. Not everyone believed justice had been fully served. Some questioned how a woman who had no prior criminal record, no violent past, and no known history of abuse could suddenly plan and execute such a cold-blooded murder. Others were convinced she had simply gotten caught in a spiral of fear, secrecy, and survival instincts that spiraled beyond her control. After the sentencing, a series of anonymous tips were called in to the local police department. One in particular stood out, a voice claiming that Adam Whitmore had been involved in something dangerous prior to his death, something he had kept hidden from even his closest friends. The caller said Adam owed money to someone out of state, and that his disappearance had been orchestrated by more than just his wife. Detectives followed the lead, but found no concrete evidence to support it. Adam's financials were clean, his travel history uneventful. It appeared to be just another theory, one of many that now swirled around the case like ghosts refusing to rest. As months passed, a deeper portrait of Sandra began to emerge from old journals and letters discovered in a storage unit she had rented under a false name. Some entries were fragmented, almost manic, detailing dreams of escape, guilt over lies, and references to Adam in both loving and resentful tones. The writings didn't provide a confession or clear motive, but they revealed a woman mentally unraveling, torn between reality and the life she had constructed for others to see. The most haunting passage read, "They say grief has stages, but what if I never stopped pretending he was alive, just so I wouldn't have to admit what I did?" With Sandra in prison, the Whitmore house was put up for sale. It sat empty for over a year, locals unwilling to buy a home with such a sinister history. Weeds grew tall in the yard, paint chipped from the shutters, and the once pristine porch sagged with neglect. Eventually, an out-of-town investor bought the property, planning to tear it down and rebuild. When demolition began, the workers found nothing else hidden, no further secrets in the walls or beneath the floorboards, just dust, echoes, and silence. To this day, the case remains one of Willow Creek's most disturbing tragedies. Sandra Whitmore's name became a symbol of mystery, of hidden darkness, and of the horrifying lengths people can go to keep their secrets buried. The 911 call she made that night was not just a cry for help. It was the final crack in a carefully built facade that had held for 6 years, and once it broke, the truth clawed its way to the surface, not with a scream, but with the silent revelation of bones hidden beneath the very home that once sheltered a family.